On October 28, 2008, in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, a German car company that most people outside the industry had barely heard of briefly became the single most valuable company on the entire planet, worth more on paper than ExxonMobil. That company was Volkswagen, and it did not become the most valuable company in the world because business was suddenly good. Its share price had simply been driven into orbit by a much smaller rival, roughly 1/15 its size, quietly trying to swallow it whole. This is the story of how Porsche nearly bought a company 15 times its own size, briefly pulled off one of the most audacious financial maneuvers in corporate history, and then watched the entire plan collapse so completely that Volkswagen ended up buying Porsche instead. The man behind this plan was Wendelin Wiedeking, the same executive who had already rescued Porsche once before, first by cutting costs to save the company from bankruptcy in the 90s, then by pushing through the deeply controversial Cayenne SUV that ended up funding the entire business. By the mid-2000s, Wiedeking was flying high, running the most profitable car company on earth, and he set his sights on something far bigger: control of Volkswagen itself, the largest car manufacturer in Germany, a company that built roughly 50 times as many vehicles as Porsche did every year. For decades, this would have been legally impossible. A law dating back to 1960, put in place when Volkswagen was privatized, capped any single shareholder's voting power at 20%, no matter how many shares they actually owned, specifically to protect the state of Lower Saxony and Volkswagen's workforce from an outside takeover. Starting in 2005, Porsche began quietly buying Volkswagen shares anyway, betting that this legal shield would eventually fall. In October of 2007, it did. The European Court of Justice ruled that the voting cap violated European rules on the free movement of capital and struck it down. Overnight, the path to a full takeover of Volkswagen was legally open, and Porsche, which had already spent roughly €5 billion quietly building a 31% stake, suddenly had a green light to keep going. Rather than simply buying more stock on the open market, where large purchases trigger public disclosure requirements, Porsche built much of its remaining position through cash-settled options, spread deliberately across multiple different banks, allowing it to accumulate enormous economic exposure to Volkswagen's share price without immediately revealing the true size of its hand. For years, Porsche's public position stayed carefully vague. Behind the scenes, the stake kept growing toward a very specific number, 75%, the threshold required under German corporate law to force a full domination agreement over another company. By October of 2008, the setup was extraordinary, though almost nobody outside Porsche fully understood it yet. Between its direct shareholding and its option positions, Porsche controlled roughly 74% of Volkswagen. The state of Lower Saxony held another 20%, a stake protected separately under what remained of German law. That left less than 6% of Volkswagen's shares actually available to trade freely on the open market. At the exact same time, hedge funds around the world, many of them foreign, had bet heavily against Volkswagen, shorting roughly 13% of the company, wagering its stock would fall as the financial crisis crushed car sales everywhere. In Germany, where a few years earlier a senior politician had famously compared aggressive foreign hedge funds to locusts stripping companies bare, the setup had an unmistakable narrative already baked into it: a beloved national car maker quietly defended by another beloved national car maker against a swarm of outside speculators betting on its collapse. On Sunday, October 26th, Porsche dropped the announcement that changed everything, confirming publicly for the first time just how large its combined position in Volkswagen had actually become, and stating its clear intention to eventually take full control. For the hedge funds holding short positions, the math turned catastrophic almost instantly. They needed to buy roughly 13% of Volkswagen's shares to close out their bets, but less than 6% of the company was actually available to purchase. There simply were not enough shares in the world to go around. Panicked funds began bidding the price up against each other just to get their hands on any shares at all, and that panic fed on itself. Over the following 2 trading days, Volkswagen's share price rocketed from around €200 to more than €1,000, briefly touching a market capitalization north of €300 billion, making it, For a few surreal hours, the most valuable listed company on the face of the earth, ahead of every oil giant and every technology company anywhere. Porsche, sitting on the other side of that trade, quietly sold off around 5% of its own holdings at those absurd prices, walking away with more than $10 billion in profit in a matter of weeks. Hedge funds, on the other hand, are estimated to have lost roughly $30 billion combined, making this the largest short squeeze in financial history up to that point, engineered not by a crowd of retail traders on the internet, but by one car company against the rest of the financial world. Trading floors around the world had genuinely never seen anything like it. Ordinary shares of a car company that had been sitting around €200 a week earlier were suddenly changing hands at prices that made no fundamental sense for a business selling fewer cars every month as the global economy shut down around it. Financial journalists scrambled to explain a stock price that had nothing to do with Volkswagen's actual earnings and everything to do with a supply of shares that had essentially vanished overnight. Some hedge funds, staring at losses growing by the hour, tried to hold their positions and wait for the price to come back down to earth. Others simply capitulated and bought at whatever price they could get, accepting catastrophic losses rather than risk even larger ones. Regulators in multiple countries opened inquiries into whether Porsche's disclosures, or lack of them, in the months leading up to the announcement had been fair to the market, questions that would eventually harden into the criminal case filed against Wiedeking and Herder years later. It looked, for a moment, like the greatest corporate coup in modern history. Then the same financial crisis that had just made Porsche a fortune turned around and destroyed it. Building that 74% position had not come free. Porsche had taken on massive debt to buy up all of those shares and options somewhere in the range of 9 to 13 billion euros at the exact moment global credit markets were freezing solid and no bank on earth particularly wanted to lend anyone money. In January of 2009, Porsche pushed its stake even higher, past 50% of Volkswagen's voting rights, and publicly reaffirmed it would still reach its 75% domination threshold by the end of the year. But behind the scenes, the company could not refinance its own mounting debt. By May of 2009, Porsche was forced to abandon the takeover plan entirely, quietly reframing what had been an aggressive pursuit of total control as a friendly merger discussion instead. 2 months later, in July of 2009, Wendelin Wiedeking, the man who had twice already saved this company, resigned, along with his chief financial officer, Holger Harder. Wiedeking left with a severance payment reported at around $70 million, a figure so controversial in Germany that he publicly pledged to donate half of it to charity. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund stepped in with fresh capital to help stabilize Porsche's crushing debt load, eventually becoming a major shareholder in the combined group itself. By November of 2009, Porsche Automobile Holding posted a full-year loss of 4.4 billion euros, driven almost entirely by write-downs on the very option positions that had briefly made it look like a genius. What happened next is the twist that makes this story remarkable. Instead of Porsche swallowing Volkswagen, Volkswagen swallowed Porsche. Volkswagen agreed to buy roughly half of Porsche's actual car-making business for close to 4 billion euros as a first step, with the rest to follow over the coming years. And by 2012, Porsche's sports car operation was fully absorbed into the Volkswagen Group, becoming just one more badge inside the same empire alongside Audi, Bentley, Bugatti, and Lamborghini. The Porsche and Piëch family did not walk away empty-handed, though. Their separate holding company retained a controlling voting stake in the combined Volkswagen Group itself, a position that to this day still gives the family effective control of the entire empire. The family that started this whole gamble did technically end up controlling Volkswagen in the end, just not through the triumphant hostile takeover Wiedeking had spent 4 years engineering, and not with him still in the room to see it happen. Years later, in 2012, German prosecutors charged Wiedeking and Herder with market manipulation, accusing them of publicly denying their full takeover intentions while secretly planning exactly that months in advance. In 2016, a German court declined to send the case to trial, citing insufficient evidence for a conviction, and both men walked away without a criminal record. The episode left a lasting mark well beyond Porsche and Volkswagen themselves. Regulators in Germany and across Europe pointed to the squeeze as a case study in how thin a company's freely traded shares can become before the stock market itself stops functioning normally, and the affair fed directly into a broader political push for tighter disclosure rules around exactly the kind of cash-settled options Porsche had used to build its position so quietly. For ordinary investors watching from the outside, the lesson looked almost fable-like. A small, proud, family-controlled sports car maker had briefly humiliated some of the largest and most sophisticated hedge funds on the planet, only to discover that the debt required to pull off that humiliation was every bit as dangerous as the enemy it had just defeated. There is a strange symmetry sitting underneath this entire saga. The same leadership that took a calculated, deeply unpopular risk with the Cayenne and got rewarded for it with the biggest financial turnaround in the company's history, took an even bigger, far more leveraged risk-chasing Volkswagen, using debt instead of patience, speed instead of consensus, and this time, the bet consumed the company that made it. One gamble saved Porsche by expanding what the brand was allowed to be. A very similar kind of ambition, pushed one step too far and financed with borrowed money at the worst possible moment in modern financial history, nearly destroyed it and ended with the smaller company folded permanently into the very giant it once tried to own outright. Even now, the family still sits at the top of that giant. They just got there by losing, not by winning. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like and subscribe for more deep dives into the brands and companies quietly falling apart or quietly saving themselves behind the scenes.